Hey, hello everybody. My name's Pat Kennelly. I'm with the Center for Peacemaking here at Marquette. I know most of you know about the center, but if you don't, we're a co-curricular institution, or at least department here within the university. We offer a variety of opportunities for students to put nonviolence into action. We provide funding for research and experiments with today at the Soup with Substance, which is a program put on every Wednesday at noon in conjunction with campus ministry. We have Jim Douglas. Jim Douglas is a theologian, scholar, activist, and practitioner of nonviolence who since the 1950s has been conducting his own experiments with truth. Whether it's resisting the Vietnam War, our infatuation with nuclear weapons, opening Catholic worker houses, peacemaking in Gaza, Baghdad, Sarajevo. Jim is constantly on the front lines helping us expand our understanding of nonviolence. Today he's going to talk a little bit about his new book, JFK and the Unspeakable. And then tomorrow he's going to have a talk at 7 o'clock in the Rayner Library on Gandhi and nonviolence and the implications for Gandhi when he turned towards peacemaking. So without further ado, James Douglas.
Does this work okay? Okay, thank you. And thanks for coming, which is more difficult than usual today. I want to share about the story of John Kennedy, but also the story of Barack Obama and their relationship, both of them, to what the great monk and writer Thomas Merton called the unspeakable, which raises great dangers for John Kennedy, Barack Obama, and everyone in the world. What does it mean to be transformed as President of the United States at the edge of total nuclear war into a peacemaker? John F. Kennedy's turn toward peace, resulting in his assassination, provides a parable of the unspeakable for President Barack Obama and ourselves in the midst of our war on terror. Can we discover hope for our enlightenment and for our resurrection as one human family through the dark truths of Dallas? John Kennedy lived with death as the raven on his shoulder. From an early age, death was his companion. From his earliest memories as a child, death was always there. Lying in bed with scarlet fever when he was 2 and 3 years old, suffering from illnesses that never seemed to end, a chronic blood condition in boarding school, a debilitating combination of colitis and ulcers, intestinal ailments while he was at Harvard, osteoporosis and crippling back problems intensified by war injuries that plagued him until the end of his life. To those who knew him well, Jack Kennedy always seemed to be sick and dying. Death was always one step away. He did not fear it. What Kennedy came to fear, especially when he became president, was not his own death, but the death of humanity by nuclear war. Kennedy's fear of nuclear war deepened after his 1961 meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. Late at night on the June 5, 1961 plane flight back to Washington, the wearied president asked his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, if she would please file the documents he had been working on. As she started to clear the table in the plane, Evelyn Lincoln noticed a little slip of paper that had fallen on the floor. On it were two lines in Kennedy's handwriting, a favorite saying of his from Abraham Lincoln. He'd written, "I know there is a God, and I see a storm coming. If he has a place for me, I believe that I am ready." The summit meeting with Khrushchev had deeply disturbed Kennedy. The American president thought the Soviet chairman had shown no real concern about nuclear war, and that he was unwilling to compromise, making a nuclear holocaust far more likely. Kennedy saw a terrifying storm coming, yet if God had a place for him, he believed that he was ready. John F. Kennedy was in the same dire position every U.S. president has been in since World War II. As president, Kennedy was under the control of what his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, identified in his farewell address as the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower said, "Its total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government," and one could add, every university. The military-industrial complex, more powerful today than ever, imprisons the president. A president is always accompanied by a military attaché bearing a nuclear code that can incinerate the earth. That gun to the world is a gun to the president. When he accepts the power to kill everyone, the president becomes a prisoner, morally and politically, to the demands of our national security state. Whether his name is Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, or Barack Obama, once he accepts nuclear power over the world, his permissible movement as president is confined to a very tight space, tighter than we as citizens might imagine. President Kennedy rebelled against the economic, political, even spiritual influence that President Eisenhower described. During JFK's 2 years and 10 months in power, while that power pressured him relentlessly, he compromised with it to survive a few months. But in the end, he stood his ground and he took the bullets. Kennedy's transformation was prophesied in a strange way by Thomas Merton, who saw through politics from his monastery in the hills of Kentucky. In a letter Merton wrote to a friend in January 1962, 1 year into Kennedy's presidency, the monk summed up the president in a negative yet prophetic way. He wrote, "I have little confidence in Kennedy. I think he cannot fully measure up to the magnitude of his task. He lacks creative imagination and the deeper kind of sensitivity that is needed. Too much the Time and the Life magazine mentality, than which I can imagine nothing further in reality from, say, Lincoln. What is needed in the president is really not shrewdness or craft, but what the politicians don't have: depth, humanity, and a certain totality of self-forgetfulness and compassion, not just for individuals, but for humanity as a whole. A deeper kind of dedication. Maybe Kennedy will break through into that someday by miracle. But such people are before long marked out for assassination. The unspeakable is a term that Thomas Merton coined at the heart of the 60s after JFK's assassination. In the midst of the escalating Vietnam War, the nuclear arms race, and the further assassinations of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. In each of those soul-shaking events, Merton sensed an evil whose depth and deceit seemed to go beyond the capacity of words to describe. Nuclear war was an expression of the unspeakable. Only 3 months after he became president, John Kennedy became the target of a covert operation by his own CIA. JFK approved a CIA plan to lead its trained Cuban exile brigade as an invasion force at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. The president said he would never commit U.S. troops to such an operation. The CIA lied to him, saying the Cuban people were on the verge of a revolution against their government and would support the invading force. The CIA also lied about the terrain, claiming the brigade could become a guerrilla force where in fact there was no such environment. Kennedy realized afterwards he had been set up by the CIA. The exile brigade was totally futile, as the CIA knew in advance. They were trapping him. The president had to either send U.S. combat troops into Cuba in an all-out war, or he had to accept a huge defeat. JFK swallowed defeat. He then said, in recognition of the CIA's trap, that he wanted, as he said, I want to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. The Bay of Pigs enabled Kennedy to see the cloaked demands of the CIA and the Pentagon as a usurpation of his power as president. He began to break free from his military and his intelligence commanders. Prisoners get shot for doing that. JFK's decision to fire CIA Director Allen Dulles, who was the most powerful Cold Warrior in Washington, D.C., and his decision to fire all of Dulles' deputies in the wake of the Bay of Pigs, for which they were responsible, was his first step toward freedom, meaning also his death. An American parable was in the making. As Kennedy turned more heretically toward peace after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the parable of the president and the powers that be would be played out until it climaxed a year later on a sunny street in Dallas. Then it would be open up to us to open our ears and hear that parable. I'm a Catholic worker, like some of you are. I am deeply skeptical of the power of kings and presidents, all of them. But what I also learned from Dorothy Day, the mother of the Catholic worker movement, was a belief in the goodness of every human being. Dorothy had that belief in John Kennedy. She told me pointedly after JFK's death to study his life. I didn't know that she and Kennedy had met. Young Jack Kennedy and his older brother Joe, who would die in World War II, visited the Mott Street Catholic Worker in Manhattan one day in the summer of 1940. John Kennedy's visit to the New York Catholic Worker was confirmed for me by your own Marquette University Catholic Worker archivist, Phil Runkle, with whom I visited yesterday. Phil Runkle sent to me copies of several pages from the Catholic Workers guest book for the summer of 1940. Included in the signatures between July 29th and August the 4th, 1940, is that of John F. Kennedy, Hyannis, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Dorothy Day's longtime co-worker, Stanley Wisniewski, recalled Kennedy's visit in an interview, television interview he once gave with Bill Moyers. What Wisniewski said about Kennedy being there. I remember distinctly how bewildered John Kennedy was by the sight of the poverty and the misery of the place. And then Dorothy came in. She talked to him. Then Dorothy says, "Come and have supper with us." And Kennedy looked at her a little startled and says, "No, come out and have dinner with us instead." So Dorothy and Joe and John Kennedy, we went out to a little restaurant around the corner. We had a wonderful conversation. And this is what Dorothy says about it in her book, Loaves and Fishes. She said that we talked long into the night of war and peace, and of man and the state. Even when Dorothy Day was marching and speaking out decades later against JFK's Cold War policies, something about him struck the chord of her belief in human goodness. So she said to me after he was killed, "Pay attention, learn more about his life." It took me over 30 years to follow her recommendation. Yes, we can learn more from his life and from his death. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy had to confront the unspeakable in the form of total nuclear war. At the height of that terrifying conflict that his own anti-Castro policies had helped precipitate, he felt the situation spiraling out of control, especially because of pressures and provocations by his generals in the Pentagon. They kept going past the limits in order to provoke the Soviet Union to begin to show a sign of launching missiles, at which point then automatically they would send in bombers, missiles, and with a far larger number of missiles than the Soviet Union had, strike first and, in their terms, win a nuclear war. Kennedy was aware of those provocations, and that's what moved toward this conclusion. The tipping point of the missile crisis, when war seemed almost inevitable, occurred when a Soviet surface-to-air missile, one from the ground, shot down a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance plane over Cuba, killing the Air Force pilot. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Executive Committee of the National Security Council had already recommended immediate retaliation in such a case. They're pressuring Kennedy. We have to strike now. They urged an all-out attack on Cuba early the next morning. There was the feeling, said Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, the President's brother, there was a feeling that the noose was tightening on all of us, on Americans, on humankind, and that the bridges to escape were crumbling. However, JFK called off the Air Force reprisal for the U-2's downing. He continued to search for a peaceful resolution. The President and the Attorney General met in the Oval Office, and JFK shared with his brother his deepest fear. He said to, well, this is the way Robert described it, the thought that disturbed him the most, Robert said, and that made the prospect of war much more fearful than it would otherwise have been, was the specter of the death of the children of this country and of all the world. The young people who had no role, who had no say, who knew nothing even of the confrontation, but whose lives would be snuffed out like everyone else's. They would never have a chance to make a decision, to vote in an election, to run for office, to lead a revolution, to determine their own destinies. It was this, wrote Robert Kennedy in notes that were published after his own assassination, that troubled him most, that gave him such pain. This thought that troubled President Kennedy so much, that gave him such pain, was one of compassion. A compassion for the children of this world who had no role in a nuclear war and would not survive it. It was a transforming moment in Kennedy's life. It was what Thomas Burton had envisioned when he wrote, "Maybe Kennedy will break through into that totality of self-forgetfulness and compassion someday by miracle. But such people are before long marked out for assassination. When JFK experienced that moment of turning, he made the most crucial decision of his presidency. He decided that his brother Robert should meet secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and personally convey the president's great concern, as Robert put it. At a moment when the world was falling into darkness, Kennedy did what his generals thought was unforgivable. He not only rejected their pressures for attacking Cuba and the Soviet Union, even worse, the president reached out to the enemy for help. That could be considered treason. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw it as hope. Robert Kennedy had met secretly with Anatoly Dobrynin, at that point warning that the president was losing control of his generals and needed that help. When Khrushchev received Kennedy's plea for help in Moscow, he turned to his foreign minister, Unspeakable, and he said, "We have to let Kennedy know that we want to help him." Khrushchev hesitated when he heard himself say help. Just when the U.S. president seemed to be at his wit's end, did he, Khrushchev, his enemy, really want to help him? Yes, he did. He repeated the word help to his foreign minister, and he said, "Yes, help. We now have a common cause to save the world from those pushing us toward war." So how could we understand that moment? The two most heavily armed leaders in the history of the world, on the verge of total nuclear war, suddenly joined hands against those on both sides pressuring them to attack. Khrushchev ordered the immediate withdrawal of his missiles in return for Kennedy's public pledge never to invade Cuba and his secret promise to withdraw U.S. missiles from Turkey, as he would in fact do. They were in the same position in relation to the Soviet Union, our missiles were, as the Soviet missiles in Cuba were in relation to the U.S. Kennedy knew that. His advisors refused to recognize that. The two Cold War enemies had turned, so that each now had more in common with his opponent than either one had with his own generals. Neither John Kennedy nor Nikita Khrushchev was a saint. As you know, Nikita Khrushchev was a follower of Stalin for a good part of his life. John F. Kennedy was a cold warrior. Each was deeply complicit in policies that brought humankind to the brink of nuclear war. Yet, when they encountered the void, they turned to each other for help. In doing so, they turned humanity toward the hope of a peaceful planet. Kennedy kept walking in that direction. On June 10, 1963, he gave his American University address, the most important speech he gave in his life, in which he envisioned an end to the Cold War. He said he was unilaterally stopping the U.S. testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, and that he was going to seek a treaty with Nikita Khrushchev to stop that. In July 1963, only 6 weeks later, Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to the partial nuclear test ban treaty in an astonishingly short length of time. And it was negotiated really by Kennedy himself by a phone in the White House. In September, climaxing a grassroots campaign organized from the White House that turned U.S. public opinion around, the Senate passed the test ban treaty by a large margin. That was like getting that kind of a treaty through today in the current Congress, not the one that Obama got it through in December. Also, in September 1963, JFK initiated a secret dialogue with Fidel Castro to normalize U.S.-Cuban relations, which hasn't happened to this day. Kennedy's first back-channel representative in that dialogue was meeting with Castro in Cuba at the very time JFK was assassinated. The U.S.-Cuban dialogue died in Dallas. On October 11, 1963, President Kennedy signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, ordering that U.S. troops be withdrawn from Vietnam, an order that President Johnson, his successor, quietly voided immediately after his assassination. The Vietnam War was reignited by Kennedy's murder. President Kennedy's courageous turn from global war to a strategy of peace provides the why of his assassination. Because he turned toward peace with our enemies, the communists, he found himself at odds with his own national security state. Peacemaking had risen to the top of his agenda as president. That was not the kind of leadership that the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the military-industrial complex wanted in the White House. Given the Cold War dogmas that gripped those dominant powers, and given Kennedy's turn toward peace, his assassination followed as a matter of course. It was a transparent act of state. Just as John Kennedy did, Barack Obama had a Bay of Pigs early in his presidency. He became the target of a covert operation that trapped and compromised him as president. In Obama's case, the challenge to his authority as commander-in-chief came not from the CIA, but from the Army, and not in Cuba, but in Afghanistan. As in Kennedy's case, Obama's response to the entrapment established the pattern of his presidency, but in a direction opposite to Kennedy's. Obama has become an obedient servant to his national security state, and as a result, a source of despair to many of his supporters. The critical background to President Obama's June 2010 firing of General Stanley McChrystal for his outlandish Rolling Stones interview was that General McChrystal's close relationship to the man whom Obama named to replace him. The President's newly appointed Afghan commander, General David H. Petraeus, was McChrystal's boss and his mentor. In September 2009, McChrystal had been Petraeus' point man in a Pentagon threat of revolt unless the President escalated the Afghan war. Heavily supported by Republican leaders, General McChrystal pressured Obama publicly by a series of statements questioning the President's initial resistance to the General's recommendation of 40,000 more troops. Petraeus, then his boss, Petraeus, also went public, telling a columnist the U.S. would fail in the war unless the President gave them the troops they absolutely needed. Obama's generals were conducting a media war to force him into a decision they had already chosen for him. As Bob Woodward has reported in his book, Obama's Wars, the President was blocked at every turn by his war cabinet as he sought alternative troop options and an exit plan for the war. However, the generals wanted their troops surged and an open-ended strategy for the war. They provided no exit plan. So Obama said to them, "You're not really giving me any options. You agreed to go back and work those up, like I ordered you to." Instead, these guys kept pressuring him for the same troop increase under different guises in a war without end. Obama said, "It's unacceptable." He told civilian advisors, the president told civilian advisors, that the military heads were, as he put it, really cooking the thing in the direction they want. They are not going to give me a choice. And they didn't. The president finally gave them 30,000 more troops, while setting a shaky date of next July, as you know, for a beginning withdrawal. This last December, 2 months ago, 2010, Afghanistan Review announced that the U.S. NATO occupation will continue until at least 2014. The generals have claimed victory. General Petraeus was pleased. His counterinsurgency strategy was alive and well. As he let Woodward know, he said, if the president had told me at the beginning that it would come out with this strategy and 30,000 troops, I'd have taken it in a second. Moreover, Petraeus said privately he continued to see no end in sight in Afghanistan. You have to recognize also, he said, that I don't think you ever win this war. I think you keep on fighting. This is the kind of fight we're in for the rest of our lives, and probably our kids' lives. When Obama replaced McChrystal half a year later by the more subtle, more controlling Petraeus, it was a further submission to the military authorities that the president was elected to command. After JFK was set up by the CIA with the Pentagon's support at the Bay of Pigs, that new young president bucked his national security state, firing his main adversary, Cold Warrior-in-Chief Allen Dulles. By the way, Allen Dulles, when he's fired by Kennedy, and when Kennedy is assassinated, what happens to him? He becomes the chief member of the so-called Warren Commission investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. This is like appointing the fox to investigate the murder in the henhouse. When Obama was set up by General Petraeus, General McChrystal, and their colleagues to escalate the war in Afghanistan, our new young president, after, to his credit, months of deliberation, reluctantly went along. His later insertion of Petraeus as his new Afghan commander put the most likely Republican candidate for president in 2012, General David Petraeus, in an ideal running position. Because Bush's surge of troops in Iraq under Petraeus has been judged what they call a win, Obama will be blamed for the loss if a proxy government in Iraq fails after his troop withdrawal. Last August, General Petraeus warned further, if the U.S. loses in Afghanistan, there would likely be a bloody civil war followed by a takeover by extremists. He added, if the U.S. succeeds and Afghanistan stabilizes, the country could become the region's new Silk Road with the potential to extract trillions of dollars worth of minerals. If General Petraeus fails in his counterinsurgency war to pacify that new road to corporate profits, he can keep on saying he needed more troops and more time to win there, preparing the political ground for another Obama loss. Petraeus can then return home for a draft to run for president. Obama, by surrendering to his generals, has been trapped in the same kind of plotting that Kennedy had the insight and the courage to resist. Barack Obama is also a very smart and sometimes courageous man. Why did he submit to his generals? By widening a disastrous war. Did he think he could at least use his power to improve the domestic state of the Union, while hoping he could eventually find a way out of our downward spiral of war in Afghanistan and Pakistan? If so, he will finally have to say no, for the sake of us all, to his generals and the powers behind them. They will always want the troops to fight more battles. for the rest of our lives, and probably our kids' lives, toward the end of trillions of dollars worth of minerals on a new Silk Road. Can any president of the United States, anyone, any president of the United States, turn toward peace without being threatened, set up, and if necessary, from the standpoint of our national security state, assassinated? Because of our unwillingness to connect the dots of Dallas with those of Washington, U.S. citizens have been unable to raise that post-JFK question to consciousness. In the Washington of Barack Obama, where some speak of a president's assassination casually and others deliberately, it is time that we dealt with the question in a serious way. John Kennedy did. From his frequent remarks anticipating his own death, friends said he was obsessed by it. He seems rather to have seen his death in a remarkably detached way, in a time of darkness, accepting his own demise, if necessary, from the standpoint of his conscience, as the simple consequence of doing his duty. Once we face the why of Kennedy's assassination, never really mysterious, and now a story documented by the massive files made public by the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s, we can deal with an obvious question that has likely passed through the mind of Barack Obama. Can a peacemaking president survive a war-making state? A conscientious president's survival and the carrying out of peace initiatives against the grain of his government and corporate power is entwined with the survival of every human being on this earth. The president's vulnerability, while he tries to turn a massive Washington warship toward peace and disarmament, is an unspeakable fact of our politics. But the other side of the unspeakable is ourselves. Our sense of despair when we see a president's reluctance to choose what may kill him raises questions about ourselves. Martin Luther King said in his last testament, a little book published after his death called Trumpet of Conscience, can a nonviolent direct action movement find application on the international level to confront economic and political problems? I believe it can. It is clear to me that the next stage of the movement is to become international. King envisioned an international movement of massive, nonviolent civil disobedience, bringing the business of London, Paris, Washington, and Ottawa to a halt until such centers of autocracy address the real questions of democracy. He said we needed to shut down our marketplaces by nonviolent action until business as usual was opened up to the needs of us all, beginning with the poorest, the most exploited people on earth. The way our greatest prophet addressed the military-industrial complex was to think and to act beyond it. That is why he planned the Poor People's Campaign for Washington. He was initiating it in Memphis, April 1968, supporting the sanitation workers' strike there when he was shot to death. He wanted all those who had nothing to lose to come together in D.C. that spring and summer, however long it would take, to shut down the government by nonviolent resistance until it agreed to shut down poverty and war. Martin Luther King was saying that Washington and Wall Street did not have the final say. There was and there is a world out there, from the heartland of the USA to the heartbeat of the Congo, from the suffering of those in Appalachia to those struggling in the Amazon. If we are willing to struggle, suffer, and die together nonviolently, anything is possible for our world. King's global nonviolent vision is waiting to be realized if we are willing to carry it out, paying the price just as he did. Martin King, like the prophets before him, knew the towering powers that overwhelm us when we think small are themselves small time. He reminded us that our Pentagon generals and Wall Street barons are not in ultimate charge of reality any more than we as individuals are. The arc of the universe, he said, bends toward justice. So let's not give up on our brother Barack Obama or on ourselves. And let's not give up on our brothers and sisters in the Pentagon and on Wall Street. Nonviolence is the most powerful force in existence. We can all become part of its movement. On the first day of school, September the 8th, 2009, at Wakefield High School in Arlington, Virginia, a ninth grader named Lily asked President Obama, if you could have dinner with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be? The president said his first choice for a dinner companion would be Gandhi. As he put it, a real hero of mine, because if it had been for the nonviolent movement in India, you might not have seen the same nonviolent movement for civil rights here in the United States. Gandhi ended up doing so much and changing the world just by the power of his ethics, by his ability to change how people saw each other and saw themselves. Gandhi was able to help people who thought they had no power realize that they had power, and then help people who had a lot of power realize that if all they're doing is oppressing people, then that's not a really good exercise of power. So maybe we all need to sit down for a meal with Gandhi. One that would be, as President Obama told Lily, a really small meal. Maybe like the one you just had. Because Gandhi didn't eat a lot. What Gandhi would say to us over that small meal, he did say at the end of his life to a U.S. writer, Vincent Sheehan, who traveled halfway around the world from a farm in Vermont to question Gandhi on vital matters, anticipating that Gandhi was about to be assassinated, as Gandhi would be in Sheehan's presence 3 days after they met. As the two men paced a room together, the great big American and the little Indian, Gandhi told his American visitor, with reference to World War II culminating in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, your ends may have been good, but your means were bad. That is not the way of truth. If Gandhi's earnest conversation partner were Obama, not Sheehan, and the time today, perhaps the next question would be, what is the way of truth in Afghanistan? For Gandhi, truth was God. Truth force was his term for nonviolence, satyagraha. Gandhi acted on the belief that there is nothing we as human beings can do that is more powerful, more transforming than to live out the truth as we know it, at the deepest point in our conscience. In dialogue today with a powerful man who knows that, as he put it, oppressing people is not a really good exercise of power, Gandhi would say that hearing the truth and acting on it, regardless of the consequences to one's power and one's self, would be the way of truth in Afghanistan and in Washington. As politically confining as the White House is, it is for that very reason an ideal place to live out the truth, as President Kennedy did. The ultimate reach of Lily's question is a challenging one for us all, and President Obama's Gandhian response is a seed of hope. The month before his election as president, Barack Obama also invoked Gandhi as an inspiration. On that occasion, Gandhi as community organizer, the community organizer of a massive nonviolent revolution. President-to-be Obama said, quote, Gandhi's portrait hangs in my office to remind me that real change will not come from Washington. It will come when the people, united, bring it to Washington. Obama's pre-election Gandhi statement included a reference to the war in Iraq. He said, "We've watched our standing in the world erode as we continue to lose American lives in a war that should have never been authorized and never been waged." Candidate Obama's words on Iraq apply with equal urgency today to the war in Afghanistan and a threatened war in Iran, in the context of a global strategy of war on terror that, as Gandhi would say, is not the way of truth. John Kennedy recognized that the wars he was pressured to wage on Cuba, on Vietnam, and on the Soviet Union, all claimed as strategic parts of a global war on communism, were not the way of truth. With great courage, he turned away from those wars and from the false ideology of war that justified them to the truth of peacemaking. Had he not done so, had he not made that turn in the Cuban Missile Crisis, our planet would now be a nuclear wasteland. We can give thanks for the courage that took him to Dallas. Yet the vision of Gandhi and of King and the words of Obama remind us that the impetus for the kind of nonviolent change that is the condition for our survival will not come from Washington. It will come when the people united bring it to Washington. To the powers that dominate the president and the world, the most unspeakable reality of all would be our discovery as a people all over this country, all over this globe, as it's happening in big parts of the globe right now. It would be our discovery of a force more powerful than war. That would be the unspeakable. The arc of the universe bends toward justice on earth if we can believe in it and if we can act on it. Let it be. So anything you want to share? Yes, sir.
Do you think Obama was that naive when he was running for president that he did not realize how unspeakable the unspeakable was? And do you think that now that he knows how unspeakable it is, that he has a deep fear that he's unable to do what he really wants to do?
That's a great question. Well, we know that he's considered seriously before even choosing to run for president, that he recognized the threat of assassination. He consulted with many people on that, especially as a black candidate. But he's not naive. He knows what the national security state is all about, and he would have seen the even more serious implications in that respect than his being an African American. I don't believe that one could possibly become president of the United States without deepening in recognition of what you just raised. It certainly has been the case. And as he confronts his generals, you read Bob Woodward's book, he's going deeper and deeper into a kind of darkness where he's asking for withdrawal plans that they won't give him. That's precisely the same thing that Kennedy faced in regard to the Vietnam War. I didn't describe any of that. But Kennedy, from the first year of his presidency, was asking for withdrawal plans for Vietnam. They would not give him withdrawal plans. Finally, he just wrote out his national security memorandum in the fall of '63. I'm withdrawing. His generals would not give him a withdrawal plan. It's exactly the same for Obama, except Obama's response was different than Kennedy's. Yes?
For the generals, what's in it for them, this unending, perpetual state of war?
Well, if you're a general, you have a different framework. And if you believe that the war, that reality, or that the world, is constituted in such a way that there's always this overwhelming enemy out there who takes different forms. It's not the communists, it's somebody else who was the communist for many, many years. If you have that kind of a sense, and if your responsibility is to be a general, your responsibilities are primarily thinking in terms of winning and losing battles. And I don't think generals are any different than anybody else in terms of humanity. Certainly, there are a lot of great generals who have turned toward peacemaking. You want to look one up, a guy named General Smedley Butler has made incredible statements about his experience and about turning in a different direction. But when you're in the midst of those kind of pressures and thinking in the Pentagon, you think in relation to other things. And I think the Pentagon is far closer to the powers that be, which are much more powerful than the Pentagon itself. I mean, international corporate powers, financial powers, that generals look more in that direction than they do to the White House. Presidents come and go. The Pentagon tends to remain. It would be very nice if it was the reverse. But the Pentagon goes and presidents continue in a consistent peacemaking direction. That's not the way that it works right now. And that's up to us to change the ground on which presidents and generals make these decisions. That ground is our ground. That's what Martin Luther King believed. Yes?
What do you think the impact in our own hemisphere of the many changes in countries choosing presidents that represent more the interests of the poor, and now the whole situation in the Middle East, but the countries that are rising up? What is the impact of that for all the players that you've talked about?
It's an earthquake, a peaceful earthquake. You can talk, with a mixed metaphor like that. But that's the kind of vision King had. Creative tension, he called it. You can't get the kind of transformation we need in the world without huge uprisings, without enormous costs, and without some chaos. And it certainly happened during his life, and it was what he was trying to create in Washington, D.C., and the reason for his assassination, which is another story. He was assassinated because of what he was trying to create, both in resistance to the Vietnam War and creating the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., to turn over our economic structure in the United States of America and in the world, he's thinking globally. So it's very, very, very hopeful, a larger scene. And in some respects, unless we look deeply, and I say look deeply because I think there are signs of hope, we are the least hopeful part of the world right now. We don't get it. Certainly our government doesn't look like it's getting it, including our primary people who speak on this subject. But they will get it. Either that or a greater power. A greater power. What Dr. King called the arc of the universe is going to arc through this country, and the people who try to ride it out without recognizing it will not ride it out. That's what I believe. That's what I hope. Because we have to believe in an alternative to the extinction of human life on this earth. If we continue to believe in war as the resolution of conflict, that would be resolved in the way that the Cuban Missile Crisis would have resolved if it had been taken to its ultimate stage, which means nothing. That's the alternative. It's nonviolence or non-existence. And by nonviolence, I don't mean that you choose nonviolence in a moment. There are stages, there are stages, there are stages. Kennedy was prepared to trying to move through stages, but he made a commitment, even in his national security memoranda, to general and complete disarmament, not just nuclear disarmament. These documents exist. I cited them all in the book I just wrote. You can see them, you can read them. He was a very courageous president, and that's why he didn't live to the end of his presidency. Yes?
A lot of what I was hearing in Obama's State of the Union a week ago was very pro-America rhetoric, such as, Americans out-innovate, out-educate, out-compete the rest of the world. And maybe I was naive in his early presidential talks, but I don't recall that much of a strong pro-America type of language. And my question is, I don't know how to take that. I don't know if that's problematic, that even though that those are nonviolent facets, at least he's not saying like out-bomb another country. Is that problematic that it's us versus everyone else? And if so, how do you reconcile the fact that with the current state of things and the current economy, a lot of the American people, I think, maybe want to hear those types of things, but at the same time, it's again shutting us off to the rest of the world. I don't know if I'm making sense in that question, but.
Oh, it's a good question, don't you think? Yeah. It's a critical question. Well, I would not make a very good president of the United States in this case. I must say, unless one wants a very short presidency, and I think President Obama is like anybody who gets elected to that office, including John Kennedy, a person who's calculating constantly political realities. Kennedy was doing it all the time. He just decided to go the route at a certain point. He was terrified. He not only inspired by the possibility of some peacemaking, he was terrified by what he saw in the darkness of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You don't emerge from that without becoming a different kind of person, and that's the kind of miracle that Thomas Merton was hoping for. And Obama has been through that experience. Kennedy also was a warrior. He was in the Second World War. He almost died. He saved a lot of men on a PT boat. He was a very courageous warrior. He knew about war from direct first-hand experience. He hated war. He hated it. That kind of experience means a lot when you're in a position like the Oval Office in the White House. It means you might be willing to take some steps that you wouldn't otherwise if you've turned away from it. And Obama has been through those stages. He's, like all of us, hopefully all of us, learning and pray for the man and march against his policies when necessary. You do both, That's what Dorothy Day did. But hope in all of us. I hope for President Obama. I also hope for his opposition in the Congress, that we can recognize the realities of what Martin Luther King was telling us is our greatest prophet. We have to go this way, or we're going that way. That is what the prophet we need to hear most said to us, and why he died. For that matter, why Jesus died. It's the same vision. Thank you. Really good. Yes.
Obama did experience some of the depths of poverty as he was an organizer on the south side of Chicago.
Yes.
He experienced women, and especially men who could not find jobs, who were up against the power structure, and he empowered them and led them as a community organizer to take some power and to speak against this.
Yes.
Unlike most presidents, he has some real flesh experience of poverty.
That's true.
And could this, humanly speaking, this could be, if it ever emerges, could be that factor that helps him make that tough decision. But I'd like to hear your comment on to what degree this piece of his life is having impact now. Have you seen it where maybe we haven't seen it?
No, I haven't. But I would hope for what you say. But again, I would come back to the question, who are the critical players here? It is not Barack Obama. It is this circle. It is the people of the country and of the world. It's not Barack Obama. But I would hope with you that that experience of his would give him the courage to take some further steps. But we need to push for those steps in ways that go far beyond what we are doing. If he's going to do that, he's going to go the route, which means risk his presidency, risk his life. We have to do the same thing. It's easy for him to risk his life. I'll tell you that. If you're president of the United States and you decide to be a peacemaker and a justice maker, you're going way out of the front lines in an instant. We need to push hard. Our lives are a little bit more, we have a little bit more latitude, but we don't really. That's an illusion. That's an illusion. We don't really have any latitude at all. This world is on the edge of cataclysms. So it either goes the way, hopefully, of nonviolent revolution against the structures and against the powers that are destroying the entire earth and that are ready to take us down. We don't do that, we go down. And Obama is not the key player. None of these heads of state are key players. We are the key players, as the people in Egypt and in other countries are recognizing right now. We are the key players. And in this country, we're very passive players. A lot of us are. There are some very active players, too. Thank God. Yes?
I have a question about what's going on in Egypt. I'd like to know what you think is the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, and how it could impact Americans to wake up. Could we ever do something like that? Do you see that happening there?
Well, I haven't, since I've come to Milwaukee, I must confess, I haven't seen enough to evaluate properly the last 4 days. I'm sort of immersed in snowdrifts right now. And also some odds and ends. But so I know that it hasn't culminated to the point where we can see really how it's going to culminate. What's the best case scenario? That a government that is consistent with a nonviolent people's uprising would emerge. Now, what form that would take, I don't think it would take any of the forms that are being discussed in headlines, or like this guy might come in and so maybe he'd be a little bit better because he would allow this much, or, that's not what is being called for. It is a whole thinking. Vatican Council said that. We must undertake an evaluation of war with an entirely new attitude. Pope John the 23rd said that. We have lots of documents and visionaries, great apostles of nonviolence have said that. And it has to be done, and it can be done. It can be done. There are a number of countries in the world that have overturned and changed in ways that can be consistently moving in a good direction, especially countries south of the border right now. Oliver Stone did a film on that. I want to look at it sometime. Yes?
Hi. Something that was seen a lot in Kennedy's decision-making and in his cabinet's decision-making was not only the effects of his decisions overseas, but also the perception of them. Not to put it in a shallow way, but he understood that it's not just the consequences of what you do, but how others perceive it. And he seemed to have very strong goals in those perceptions. One was how other nations saw the Americans in our views of communism, in our desires for ending this nuclear struggle and achieving peace.
Yes.
Now, as Obama has been the president, obviously he's entered a situation where so many of the overseas decisions that have to be made are very contentious in people's opinions overseas and in how people can see Americans.
Yes.
What, as far as how we want to be perceived in our actions to come, like what do you think the goal should be in that regard? A
disarmed world, pretty simple.
Yeah.
a just world institutionally, in which the United States of America does not dictate to the rest of the world what its policy should be in this country or that country or whatever country. When I say a disarmed world, that would mean reparations all over the place to countries where we've waged war, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan. There is enormous cost to the people in these areas. So you can't make peace without recognizing your responsibility for war making you've done. And Obama has made some good statements, and he, when he came into office, and he still speaks for a nuclear-free world. And it was good that he went through and got the START Treaty through in December. It's a small step, but it's a step, and it's better than no step at all. But one has to be both visionary and practical. And visionary means tell the truth. And practical means commit yourself to everything you need to do to get the next step, and the next step, and the next step, and the next step. And that's what Kennedy did in the last months of his presidency. Kennedy, in the earlier stages of his presidency, didn't have that degree of commitment in any of that stuff. He moved, he deepened. And that's what one would hope for in Obama. But more important is what one would hope for in each one of us. That is the key.
I have two questions, and the first isn't really important, but the second is. First one is,
why don't you begin with it?
Sure.
Well, whatever order you want. I'll remember the second better. You're right.
Yeah, the first one is, do you have any concrete evidence beyond just circumstantial that the Pentagon or interests in the military-industrial complex were behind Kennedy's assassination?
Let me answer that before we go on to
Sure.
the second one. Well, I wrote a book about it, 500 pages long, and 100 pages of endnotes, and I think there's all kinds of concrete evidence of what the Pentagon was doing. Enormous evidence, overwhelming evidence, so much so that it...
There's the book.
So much so that we are really dumb, and we are really stupid not to be able to say John F. Kennedy was executed by his national security state, and that Oswald was in the hands of the intelligence apparatus from the beginning, although he didn't fire the fatal shots, but that he was manipulated. It's a huge scenario. It's not a small-time scenario. It's a big scenario. And there's all kinds of stuff, but I didn't talk about that because I wanted to talk about the why, and the why is far more important. And all the nonsense that's said about Kennedy's assassination, oh, the mafia did it, or Oswald did it as a lone assassin, or all kinds of spin-offs of that, is to keep us from the why. The why. But it's all integrated. The scenario to kill Kennedy has as its major purpose, not just to kill Kennedy, I'll just say this much about it. It was to win the Cold War. Kennedy was assassinated in such a way that it would be blamed on Cuba and the Soviet Union through Lee Harvey Oswald. It was set up in exactly that way. In September of 1963, people impersonating Oswald, and perhaps Oswald himself to some degree, were at the Cuban and the Soviet embassies in Mexico City setting up Oswald for the assassination of John Kennedy in such a way that as soon as the assassination occurred, the finger would go toward Cuba and the Soviet Union, specifically so that Cuba would then be invaded and the Soviet Union attacked to win the Cold War. That didn't happen. But that was the purpose behind the whole setup for Oswald. Lyndon Johnson, to his credit, didn't want to begin a nuclear war in his first stage of his presidency. To his discredit, he didn't have the guts to confront the CIA, which was the other side of it, as doing all this setup stuff in Mexico City. He didn't want to follow Kennedy in that respect. But go ahead, your second question.
Yeah, second question is, I think college students tend to talk a lot about what's right and this and that, but what are people supposed to do to realize, and just very practical, it doesn't have to be earth-shattering like Egypt, but just a small step towards realizing that kind of a vision that you propose?
Let me give you a very concrete, practical thing. A person. His name is Abdullah. Like Abdullah. And you can find him at a website. It's called ourjourneytosmile.org. No, excuse me, ourjourneytosmile.com. Ourjourneytosmile.com. Here's a letter that Abdullah wrote to all of us. He's in Afghanistan. He's 15 years old. I am 15 years old and I'm an ordinary Afghan boy. Well, maybe he's ordinary, but he's very committed to peace. He's profoundly committed to peace. He goes out. I know all this through Kathy Kelly, by the way, with whom I was last weekend, and she knows Abdullah, and she spent time with him. And he says in this letter, I wish to live without wars. I wish to live without wars. It is a deep and quiet yearning which comes from my soul and from our earth. My family buried my father in this good earth when he was killed. I remember my father's rejection of revenge, his rejection of revenge, when he spoke the Afghan proverb, blood cannot wash away blood. Sometimes my mother and I miss him, and I walk out to the hills to cry. As I go about my daily life studying and making a living, I see the rich and powerful unchanging system in which my world is violently collapsing, and hope leaves my heart. But I know I must urgently do what I can. So please, be in friendship with us as we work with Dr. Ramazan Barshadost. Dr. Ramadan Barshadost was the third-place Afghan presidential candidate in the last election. This 15-year-old is not doing things by himself. He's working with this man and with a group that's known as Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. They're all 15 to 23 or 24 years old. And they are leading a campaign in Afghanistan for peace in the same way that Martin Luther King was trying to lead us in the 1960s. There are people all over the world like this. I'm giving you a very concrete example. So please be in friendship with us as we work with Dr. Ramazan Barshadost to present nonviolent options for Afghanistan to the U.S. NATO coalition, to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda warlords, to regional countries, to the United Nations, to you and to the world. Many will laugh at me because I'm part of the impoverished majority and my voice isn't exceptional. But I will stand firm because there is a tree of nonviolence in every human heart whose roots gently say, I live and love, so I shall not kill. These roots give me my voice, and that voice is your voice too. I wish to live without wars. Salamat Bashid, be at peace. Your friend, Abdullah. This is a letter to us. He is organizing with people in the United States a specific, you want something specific, a specific plan now for 100 people from different countries, including people in this country, any of you, to go to Afghanistan and plant trees in April of this year. Think about it. Yeah.
Jim, I have an alternative answer.
Sure.
That was a great answer, but we can commit ourselves to this university we all love and are part of, to have it stop teaching war and to close the School of the Army, the School of the Navy, Marines, and Air Force that are on campus. And that is a commitment on this end that we can do right now, today, in a very practical way, because you can't, maybe you can't go to Afghanistan, but we can certainly stop the evil of teaching reflexive killing and teaching war here on campus. Thank you.
I agree with that answer too. Yes.
I wasn't going to bring this up, but after hearing what you said earlier, are
Yes.
you unconvinced by the extensive 1979 findings of the House Select Committee of Assassinations? Or do you think that it's inconclusive or maybe manipulated?
All of the above.
Oh, okay.
Inconclusive, manipulated, but a step. Every step is a step. The House Select Committee on Assassinations reached a conclusion that there was a conspiracy to assassinate.
Based on the acoustic evidence.
Yeah.
Which is...
Yeah, acoustic evidence. But then blamed it on the mafia, which is considerably short of the Central Intelligence Agency, although mafia and the Central Intelligence Agency are one in many respects when they do carry out certain actions. And the House Select Committee on Assassinations, when it began, was ready to undergo a real investigation of President Kennedy's assassination. But the man who was appointed to be the head of that was constantly harassed by the CIA. He had to be removed for the sake of there even being an HSCA, and as a result, the man who succeeded him just bowed to the CIA, and we didn't go there. We didn't go there. I appreciate your question. You obviously know something about this.
A bit.
Yeah. It's a great question. Pat is going like this. I suppose that means like this in our time.
Well, why don't we have this last question?
Okay, yes, go ahead, please.
I would just like to make the comment that unbeknownst to most people, I think, unless you're paying attention,
Yeah.
there's hundreds, if not thousands, of groups around the United States who are fighting this fight.
Yes.
And they're on the ground, and they're tying themselves to fences, and they're getting arrested. There's Catholic workers and all kinds of people that are doing these things, except they're not a unified whole, but what they're doing is that each one of them is putting another crack in the dam. And another crack is going to one day is going to equal the same thing that happened to the Berlin Wall that's all fall down, and it's all going to happen at once. So that's why each one of our actions is so important, in whether it's a small group or a large group, getting involved in a protest, through prayer, and all kinds of things.
Amen, brother. That's a good way to end.
Amen. Yeah.